All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs here at Wake University, and welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation, and on the cutting edge of post-coronavirus pedagogy. The IMC is affiliated with the Society for Political Methodology, who hopes that you will support quantitative research in political science by joining. The membership fee is just $10 a year for graduate students, and I'll post a link to join the Society in the Zoom webinar chat window right after this introduction. This week's speaker is Luke Sanford, a PhD candidate at the University of California at San Diego. He's giving a talk entitled Measurement and Inference Using Satellite Data. The talk will last 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we'll take questions from the audience. And you can ask a question at any time during the talk using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. However, I will hold pretty much all questions unless it's a very brief clarifying question until the end of the talk. A link to Luke's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation, and I will post that link right after we get started. Now I'd like to welcome Luke Sanford to the IMC. Luke, welcome.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks so much for having me. I've been really impressed so far with the previous speakers in this series, so hopefully I can sort of keep up the good work that they've been doing. So today I'm going to be presenting some research about how to use satellite data in the social sciences, and in particular how we should think about measuring things that we're interested in measuring and then doing inference in the data setting that satellite data gives us. So to motivate this, I'm going to be talking about the setting of land titling project in Benin. And in this setting, we're really interested in learning whether or not more land tenure security is associated with increased agricultural productivity. I'm going to tell you about sort of what's up with satellite data as an imagery as a data source, what are the kinds of things that we can measure, and what are the different strategies for measurement. And then I'll talk about measurement and inference in the context of Benin and tell you about some of the future directions that I'm headed with this work. So it's really a work in progress, and so any feedback that you have, I'd love to hear it either through questions on this talk or feel free to send me an email afterwards. And also, if you have other interesting ideas for applications, maybe you want to collaborate, or maybe you just want to pick my brain about how satellite data works, and I'd be happy to chat with you about either of those things. So motivation in terms of Benin, I'm interested generally in how policies affect land use. And in this project, I'm interested in how formal property rights lead to land improvement. So specifically, does improved land tenure security lead to productivity enhancing investments? And those investments, sort of most commonly in this sort of development economics literature are tree planting and investment in perennial long-term crops instead of annual crops which die off each year, and produce annual crops sort of they produce lower value per year, but they produce right away, whereas perennial crops you can think of like orchard crops that take a few years to mature but eventually produce more value. And so the setting in Benin is this project called the Plan Foncier Rural project. Took place in Benin. It was funded and implemented by the Millennium Challenge Corporation between 2009 and early 2011. And the way that it worked was they selected a large group of villages based on some criterion to be eligible for a lottery, and then randomly selected those villages into treatment and control. And then if a village was selected into treatment, they traveled to that village and figured out who owned which plots of land by working with local government and local property owners, and then demarcated those plots and walked around each of them with a GPS device. So they gave us some really nice data on where those plots are located, and then gave each plot owner a formal title to that land. So this is sort of a picture of what this looks like, and you'll see a couple more of these throughout the talk. And so if we wanted to evaluate sort of a generic project like this, now you can think of the project that you're interested in using satellite data to evaluate. We take a satellite image of the ground. So this is a picture of Benin. And maybe somebody laughed at that joke. And we'd like to randomly assign the farms or parcels of cropland into treatment and control. And then we'd like to go to each one of those and measure the outcome on each of those plots. And ideally, in this context, we'd like to measure that outcome pretty frequently. So we don't know how long it might take for crops or for people to sort of experience increased land tenure security based on having a property title. And we don't know how long it'll take them to plant these crops and for those crops to mature. So we'd like to go back and measure frequently. But the reality of this case, and I think of many similar cases, is that we only observe the treated units. And in this case, only plots in treated villages were demarcated. And so the villages that were randomly selected out of treatment, we don't know what the plots would look like that didn't get treatment. And unfortunately, when you see a treated village, it's not like a uniform chunk of plots that covers the whole village. In fact, it's a little bit more sparse than that because people in the village have to go and get the land title. And then secondly, it's often hard to convince NGO partners to go and measure untreated areas, and especially to follow up on those areas because it's expensive and it doesn't necessarily directly improve the lives of people. And secondly, even if you get people following up, you often only follow up once. And that's because it's quite costly to go and measure these places. And so we sort of get one snapshot at one point in time of the treated places, and it's quite hard to infer what those places would have looked like had they not been treated. So in Benin, there was a follow-up survey 12 to 18 months after implementation. That survey found a couple of small effects, but they tested for very many. And secondly is we don't really know what the right time to measure the outcome is. And measurement can be very costly again. So if you're here and watching this talk, you probably realize that I'm going to tell you that one of the solutions is to use satellite imagery to do the measurement. And so here we have Landsat 8 flying overhead and measuring all of our treated plots. And we're going to measure them very frequently because satellites fly overhead all the time. And then in addition to measuring our known treated plots, we're going to take samples from everywhere else. And you'll notice in this case, we're sampling some roads, some trees, some built-up areas, some grasslands, but also some cropland. And we're going to try to use that really information-rich environment to do the best job that we can of synthesizing control units for each of those treated areas. So inferring what would have happened. So I'll tell you in a second about how we get to this. But first, I want to tell you about the data source and kind of how remote sensing people think about satellite imagery. So we think about it in terms of three modalities. The first one is spectral, which is the wavelengths of light that the satellite is able to detect. The second one is temporal, which is how frequently in time the satellite flies overhead and gets an image. And the third is spatial, which is how small of objects are we able to distinguish in those images. So we'll talk about spectral first. These are different wavelengths of light that are visible. And here I'm showing you a really high resolution satellite image so that you can get an idea of what the ground truths are of some different areas in Benin. So here I've put a box around a built-up area. I've put a box around some natural trees, so a natural forest. A plot of cropland here, and this is like annual cropland, so those crops die off every year in the dry season. And then a plot with some perennial crops or some orchard. And you can see this because there are like these individual trees there. So this type of imagery is not available for free and not available at a high temporal resolution. But we'll just use this image to get some ground truths. And this is more of what we see in our free satellite imagery, for which we have a really long time record. So if you sort of squint your eyes, you can see that maybe you can still distinguish that this is built up. You can certainly distinguish that these areas are darker than these areas. But it's a lot harder to tell what's going on just from a single image. And Landsat is a series of satellites that I'll be talking about in this talk, but there are a variety of other satellites with sort of similar characteristics. That image, this image is composed of 3 bands. So, if you remember plugging your Nintendo into the back of your TV, and there are those 3 cords that you plug in, those are red, green, and blue bands. And so the satellite is able to detect those wavelengths of light in the visible spectrum, and then composite them to get a picture which looks something like what we would see if we were in space looking down at the Earth. But it's also able to detect some wavelengths of light that are outside of the visual spectrum. So it's able to detect wavelengths that go from sort of the longest wavelength that we're able to see into the infrared spectrum. And the reason this is useful for us to use these non-visual wavelengths is they're able to help us distinguish between different types of objects on the ground. So different objects absorb and reflect different wavelengths of light. And so this is sort of a chart that's on NASA's website, on the Landsat 7 website. And it shows some of the spectral signatures of different Earth features. And so in particular, if you look at broadleaf vegetation and needle-leaf vegetation, you can see that they reflect a large amount of light around 600 nanometers and absorb a lot of light around 700 nanometers. And so this wavelength is going to be close to one of the bands that Landsat can detect, which is near infrared. And this is red light. And so healthy vegetation does a good job of absorbing most of the red light, which is why it looks really green to us. But it reflects a lot of infrared light, and that's because if it were to absorb that light, it would heat up too much and be pretty unhealthy for the plant. So we can use sort of this big difference to think of some simple measures to detect things like healthy vegetation. So this is normalized difference vegetation index, a really commonly used measure of healthy vegetation in the remote sensing community. And this is the difference between the amount of near infrared light reflected and red light reflected over the sum of those 2 things. So because it reflects a lot of near infrared and absorbs a lot of red, we'll get a high or really green NDVI in areas where there are plants growing. And then we'll get a low NDVI in places where there's bare ground or where there are built-up areas. And so this is useful in this spatial resolution for thinking about what is covering each pixel. Similarly, this is the normalized difference built-up index, which is used to detect urban areas. And here, a high NDBI should exist in places where there are lots of buildings. And it's actually not doing a very good job of detecting this small built-up area, but it is noticing that these trees are very unlikely to be built up. So these are some sort of simple heuristics that people use to take advantage of the different spectral resolution of satellites. We can also use sensors on some different satellites. So this is synthetic aperture radar, which is a sensor on a satellite where the satellite flies overhead, beams radar down to the ground, and then measures how much of that radar is reflected straight back up to the sensor. And what I'm showing you is a measure of scattering. And so if not very much of that reflected radiation hits the sensor, then it means that the surface is pretty rough and scattering the radar in many directions. Whereas if almost all of it is reflected back up to the sensor, it means that there's very low scattering, or that it's a pretty flat surface. And so interestingly, you can see the road that passes through this small area as having really low scattering, or being very dark in this image. And the trees have a very high scattering. So that's because the radar sort of bounces in all directions off of those trees. And so this is a measure that's really useful in urban areas for thinking about, like, are there flat building roofs here? Or maybe we're interested in measuring something like rubble or destroyed buildings. And we can see this pretty well in synthetic aperture radar. There are also some other data sets which I'll be using in the Benin context, but I haven't made images of. So those are things like elevation, slope, and aspect of the land, which don't change over time, distance to the nearest city, and then also some rainfall or climate variables, which we can get via satellite imagery as well. So in addition to this spectral variation, or the different wavelengths of light that satellites can see, we can make use of temporal variation as well. So this is that normalized difference vegetation index over time for each one of those areas. And so the blue here is orchard. And so the orchard sort of stays green and healthy for most of the year. And so it has a higher mean than any of the other vegetation types. Whereas cropland sort of has the highest variance. There's almost no vegetation on the cropland during the dry season, and then it basically catches up with the orchard in the wet season. And then built-up areas sort of have the lowest NDVI over time. So with this time series, and this particular satellite gets an image about every 2 weeks, and some of them are cloudy, which is why you see some gaps, especially in the rainy season. We can think about features of this time series as being useful in classification. And so I've taken this time series and decomposed it into annual and semi-annual waveforms, and then visualized those waveforms in terms of their magnitude, their horizontal shift, and their vertical shift. I've visualized those here. So the colors here don't really necessarily mean anything, but if you can tell the difference between the color in these pixels and the color in these pixels, it means that we're able to detect a different wave function, a different annual wave function in those places. So using this type of spectral decomposition, we're also able to gain some intuition about what's covering the surface in these places. And so this is the semi-annual frequency decomposition. So the time series aspect of this data is also quite useful, especially when we're measuring vegetation to get an idea of what's covering the land. And in fact, time series infrared is also kind of useful for urban areas, because cities sort of absorb and emit heat differently depending on where they are and what's going on, or what's covering the land in those places. And so the third modality of satellite data that we have is spatial resolution. And so there are a lot of satellites taking images of the Earth right now. And many of them are privately owned, and they take really high resolution images. And so if you go into Google Maps and switch to satellite view, you're viewing imagery which is taken by some satellites where Google buys that satellite imagery, and they get about 1 image per year of most places. And that's about 30 centimeters spatial resolution. So each pixel is quite small, and you can see people in those images, but they're very expensive to buy, especially when you're a graduate student. 10 to 30 meter resolution is sort of the standard for people who are working with publicly available data. So data from the Landsat or Sentinel satellites is what's most commonly used. And as these satellites get newer, the spatial resolution gets higher. But if you want to evaluate something that happened in 2009, 2010, you have to use a little bit older satellite. And then we have satellites like MODIS, which has a 500 meter spatial resolution. Not very good for detecting small objects, but it passes over everywhere on Earth every 1 to 2 days. and has very many spectral bands that it's able to see. So it has really high temporal and spectral resolution, even though it has poor spatial resolution. And this is a trade-off that remote sensing people are sort of always trying to figure out which of these modalities is going to give them better measurement. So with spatial resolution, we can use some computer vision techniques, and those are things that I'm currently working on. I didn't really have quite enough done to show you how that's working yet. So check back in with me later, and I'll be happy to show you some of the results from mostly convolutional neural networks. So let's go back to Benin. Benin, if you're not familiar with it, is a country in West Africa. It's down here, highlighted in green. And today I'm going to be talking about the Alibori department, which is the northernmost department or province of Benin. I'll also be talking about Borgu, which is this one down here. And these are the two departments that I'm using to do most of the piloting of methods. And the reason for that is that the southern part of Benin, pretty much anything south of 9 degrees north, is just cloudy all the time. And so it's really, really frustrating to work with in satellite imagery. Here's a picture of all of the plots, all the treated plots in Alibori. And so there are a little over 3,000 treated plots in about 50 villages here. These are what some of these plots look like. And so this is in the high resolution imagery where we can only get it for the present period using the Google base map. But this is what these plots look like. This one has very little cropland on it. This one has some natural forest, some developed cropland, and over here it has a little bit of an orchard planted. And this one is mostly covered by orchard. And so something to note in this situation, which makes our lives difficult, is that if you asked a research assistant to go and try to draw outlines of these plots just based on the satellite imagery, they wouldn't be able to do it because it's unclear what the plot boundaries are versus what the field boundaries are. And this is an example village. So this is the village of Sokotinji, and these are all the treated plots in dark gray. And notice that also if we decided to just sort of skip all of the issues that using plots are giving us and aggregating up to the village level, that if I drew sort of the best case and drew a convex hull around all of these plots, that I would still end up with only about 30% treated area. And so aggregating up to the village level makes it really hard for us to see an effect size here, especially because we don't know where the plots are in the untreated villages. Maybe the best we can do is draw a big circle around those places. And here, we'd even be including some other nearby villages if we drew a big circle around Sokotinji. So one way that we can think about trying to evaluate this project is by using a generalized synthetic control method. And so I'm going to be talking about Yiqing-Xu's method. But there are a variety of others that you could use, sort of any of these matrix completion methods. So in this method, we're going to take all of our treated areas and measure the NDVI over time on those areas. And then we're going to randomly sample everywhere else in the country and measure NDVI on those places. And then we're going to put that into a model with some coefficients or with some variables that we think are predictive of NDVI. So in this case, that would be things like elevation, rainfall, slope, aspect, distance to a city. And then we take the error term, we'll put this into a matrix form where we're only using control observations, and we have the pre and post-treatment periods here. And we'll take that, we'll think of this error term as a matrix and do some matrix decomposition where we compose it into some time-varying factors and some unit-varying factor loadings that do the best job of approximating that. And then we'll sort of cycle back and forth where we'll put that in, and we'll re-estimate the model on just the errors from our factor model. Then we'll take those errors and put them into the model and iterate until we get convergence. And then once we have our time-varying factors set, we can take those up to the treated units and estimate factor loadings for our treated units. And once we have those, we can use the factor loadings for our treated units, the time-varying factors for our pre- and post-treatment time periods, and compute the counterfactuals for what our treated units would have looked like absent treatment. So the ATT is the difference between, it's the average difference between our treated units and our projected untreated treated units. So what do we get if we do this? Well, we have to aggregate to monthly observations, otherwise we end up with too much missingness. We'll control for rainfall, elevation, slope aspect. And we're also going to limit ourselves to dry season, because without limiting to the dry season, we end up with, once again, way too many missing values, and the imputation takes a really long time, injects a lot of uncertainty. So we can throw away some of our time variation to make things run a little bit smoother. And what we should expect to see here, if there is a treatment effect, is that in the places where people got land titles, we should see a higher dry season NDVI in those treated plots. And we can think that this would be because if you plant trees on your land, it'll raise the average amount of greenness or the average amount of vegetation that exists on that land in the dry season, as compared to places that are still using annual crops. And so this is what so on the x-axis we have day of year. On the y-axis here is our vegetation index. And pre-2009, so pre-treatment, we have a really close match between our known treated units and our synthetic control units. And this is by construction. But if this didn't match, we'd have a reason to be worried. Post-2011, we can see that there's a little bit of divergence between our treated and our synthetic control units. So our treated units have a higher dry season NDVI than our control units. And if we project further out in time, so post-2014, we're giving people about 3 or 4 years to implement these changes, we see a higher dry season NDVI in our treated units than our control units. And so this is consistent with people changing their behavior, and also consistent with this 12 to 18-month follow-up household survey that was conducted. This is only in the Borgu department. And if we instead measure what's going on in the Alibori department, we see no difference here. And we actually see a little bit of a negative, a lower dry season NDVI post-2014. But if we appropriately cluster at the village level, this difference sort of disappears. And so this method is sort of a valid inference method in this setting, but it has a couple of problems, which I'll get to in a second. But one thing that this does give us is it gives us a little bit of interpretability. So we can see that we're actually discovering latent factors, which do a good job of predicting what's growing on the land. So here we have factors 1, 2, and 3. 1 is really seasonal. 2 is positive and delayed seasonal. 3 is positive and delayed seasonal, and 2 is slightly negative. We could look at those factors across treated and control units, but more interestingly is we could look at the factor loadings over space. And so in factor 1, we have sort of a uniformly positive factor loading here. And so this is because pretty much all of Benin is experiencing this seasonality. Factor 2, remember, was this negative factor. And this is a pretty good approximation of elevation in Benin. And factor 3 is this delayed seasonality factor. And it's a little bit hard to interpret what's going on here. But this maybe should give us some confidence that our factor model is learning factors which are actually corresponding to physical attributes of the land. We could also do things like investigate individual plot effect sizes. And these are not identified, but they could be suggestive for us. And so For example, we could look at a plot where there's a large effect size, and we could look at what that plot looks like. And we could look at the 3 points which are sort of most heavily sampled in that synthetic control. We could look at how similar everywhere else is in Benin in factor space to that treated plot. And then we can look at the measurement over time. And so this might be another way to sort of make sure that our latent factor model or synthetic controls are telling us something that makes sense and isn't just sort of a black box machine learning model. So we could also look at average control similarity to plots in allegory. So here, sort of this like whitish pink means these places are really similar to all the treated plots, and the green means they're very dissimilar. And so we could see like what would have been the right places to sample had we gone out and demarcated places that would have been good controls for our treated plots. So this strategy, I think, does a good job of matching the means pre-treatment of control or of treated and synthetic control plots, and does a good job of projecting those into the future. But one of the problems is that this is a pretty poor measurement strategy. So it's hard to tell what exactly we're measuring. And when we average over an entire treated plot, it's really hard to see, for example, plots where they've devoted about 1/10 of their plot to perennial crops. Something that is very hard to detect in this setting. And so instead, we could use a measurement strategy where we could use sort of that current high resolution imagery to label polygons that are all from our study area. And I've done this and labeled about 1,000 polygons. And then we'll sample pixels from those areas with those labels, and we'll use some features to build a classifier. And then we can get annual classifications of the treated points and of random control points, and then use those control points to build some other sort of inference method. But in this case, we can do a pretty good job of classifying what exactly is on the land. So I'll take you back to this picture of Benin with our 4 different demarcated areas. And here, if we use a random forest classifier using 2 years of data, we do our spectral decomposition and throw in covariates, including elevation, rainfall, distance to city, and also sort of the mean band values for all of the bands. We can get about 93% classification accuracy, comparing areas that don't have forest to areas that do have forest. And this, because it's trained directly on Benin, it does a significantly better job of identifying forest than sort of the best thing that you can get off the shelf for forest cover. We could also break things up into 5 classes. So if we want to classify areas that are water, which I don't have in this picture, built up areas, cropland, natural forest, and planted forest, we can still get about 85% classification accuracy across these 5 different types. And so we can think about using this type of classification to measure changes over time or transitions over time. So the ongoing work, or the thing that is running on the server right now, is, well, one of several things. One is we could improve measurement by incorporating spatial features. So here we're just measuring things at the pixel level using time series and spectral variation. But we haven't used any of the spatial information. So we're not using the neighbors of a pixel to help us interpret what's going on in that pixel. And there's some good evidence from some really recent remote sensing literature that shows that we can bump up our classification and accuracy even more with that type of measurement strategy. We could also improve our inference, or we could make use of some inference strategies. So we could model a propensity score, probability of getting treatment. So far, I've had pretty bad luck with this because the treated plots are composed of such varying land cover types. It's actually really hard to tell whether a pixel is one that's likely to be selected into treatment or not. we could do some outcome modeling. So we could model, for example, the percent of an area that is going to be covered by perennial or tree crops based on our pre-treatment variables. Or we could use a matching method to try to match sort of a lower tech synthetic controls method or a matching method to try to match on pre-treatment features. A couple of other projects that I want to briefly mention that I'm working on using remote sensing data in case those pique your interest or pique any questions. Working with a big group here on training a large convolutional neural network using US census data from 2000 and 2010, and using that to measure short-term and local population and income, and then using those to answer questions about how people move in responses to the policies or to changes in natural resources or natural disasters. And then also I'm working with one of my classmates here, colleagues here, Greg Phillips, and we're looking at measuring public good provision in rebel-occupied territory. So we're trying to see if rebel governments are able to provide things like electricity, road improvement, or clearing of rubble and building new buildings. Something that's really hard to get ground truth data on, but something that we might be able to see well in satellite imagery. So we've had a little bit of early success on this. And I'm excited about that project as sort of a broader way to talk to a big set of political scientists. All right, that's what I have for my presentation. Looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Luke, for that presentation. At this point, Luke Sanford is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. I'd like to ask a question about explaining a treatment effect and controlling for the right variables. Are you controlling? I know you're controlling for like elevation and dry season, basically the things you were able to extract from that factor analysis. You mentioned a couple of other things as well. What are the other things you're controlling for?
So here, the things that I have in the model right now are rainfall, elevation, the slope, which is like how steep the hillside is, the aspect, so which direction it's facing, and then also distance to large population centers for economic reasons, because it's sort of easier to transport crops if you're closer. So
it transpires that my grandparents are farmers, and they only raise annual crops. And they do own all their land. In other words, they have very secure land tenure. And I think the reason they do that is not because they're trying to get their money out of the land as fast as possible, because they've been doing that for 40 years, but it just has to do with the suitability of the area and the market price of various products or produce items, their own expertise, the availability of water for irrigation, which might be especially important in a case where you have dry seasons and trees do need water pretty much year-round. And I'm wondering if it's possible that some of these other factors are in some way correlated with the treatment cases, or actually, I guess, they could be sort of disproportionately represented in the controls and lead to a kind of a misleading treatment effect in a way that doesn't really have to do with land tenure.
Yeah, so this is a really good and complicated question. And so in terms of thinking about this in the factor model setting, we hope that any of these characteristics of the people who own the land, or characteristics of the land, that those would show up in some way in terms of what people's behavior is prior to the treatment. And so, for example, if if your land is more suitable for annual crops, or if your expertise is in growing annual crops, that something about that will show up or will be visible from above, basically. And we don't exactly know what those features look like. But if that makes your land look different in some way, theoretically, it's something that we should be able to see. Although you may be able to imagine some pathways that would be really difficult to observe via satellite. And what we hope will get us around that is that basically, because we know that there were areas that were randomly selected to not get treatment, we know that the controls are out there in this setting, that there are good controls, and that basically our goal is to find them. And so if we can find the places that look really similar pre-treatment, hopefully we're doing a good job of selecting people who aren't fundamentally different or in a way that would bias our estimate.
Another thing I'm just sort of going through my head about like what their area looks like. For example, in where they live, I would say almost everything is planted in either corn or soybeans. And I think part of that does have to do with the climate and the soil and whatever. But another part of it might have to do with the fact of not exactly economies of scale, but sort of a related, positive externalities of the fact that everyone else is planting corn and soybeans. It develops distribution networks because there's so much of it there. The price is pretty well known. The local knowledge of how to grow it and all the services you need to fertilize it and collect it and take care of it are all kind of concentrated there. I would think that those would be quite different for trees. Some of the techniques that you would use for a cornfield would not work in a orange orchard or something. So is it the case that there could be geographic clustering, and would the satellite control selection sort of pick up on that or not?
Yeah, so this another really good question that gets at something that I've been thinking about a lot. So there's certainly geographic clustering, and I think that compared to the U.S. Midwest, that there's much more heterogeneity in what people are growing. And that as a farmer in the Benin setting, that contingent on some soil and some water decisions or characteristics, that you have a choice of what to grow that I think is a little bit more of a choice than perhaps someone who's living in the Midwest in the U.S. But there are definitely spillover effects or general equilibrium effects of if you change one person's behavior, that will spill over into neighboring areas. And right now, the way that, at least the way that the synthetic controls method is designed, is not going to capture that in the control areas. And so one possibility that I've thought about for trying to do that is, instead of randomly selecting points from all the control areas, is just taking those whole villages at a time and randomly placing those around the country. It's a little bit tricky because you place those in some pretty weird places that really don't correspond to how people might draw their plots. But it's something that would do a better job of capturing sort of the spatial dependencies in land cover.
Mm-hmm. I don't know much about the economy of Benin. I was curious, what are they growing there? What's on those trees? And do they have access to a very large international export market, or is it mostly domestic consumption?
So what's growing in Benin varies a lot by latitude. It actually makes this project challenging because you have very different climates in the northern and southern parts of the country and the middle part of the country. And so in the southern part of the country, you end up with a lot of palm plantations. In the northern part of the country, we end up growing things that are more like cashews or nut trees. And so yeah, it's hard to sort of give a general answer to that. And one reason why I think it's pretty important, and what I haven't done this, is to include latitude and longitude in sort of any classification, in addition to elevation, rainfall. And then those high value nuts are things that do get exported, but sort of all of the annual crops are things that are not exported from Benin, or very low levels of export.
So we in the diff and diff design sort of takes care of some of those trend issues, but if most of the annual crops are basically domestic, and most of the tree-borne crops are mostly cash crops, I'd want to think about like, all right, what's going to influence people shifting from one to the other? Is that somehow linked to the nature of the land or the nature of the country or what situation they're in or whatever? That's interesting. I had another idea here, which is obviously trees are not the only form of high-value capital you can put on land. And you probably don't want to, for example, build a permanent house on land you don't have secure tenure on. You probably don't want to make other sorts of improvements like buildings and things. And I'm wondering, I know it's the countryside for the most part, so I'm not 100% sure how this maps onto that, but are there other forms of capital you can see from orbit that you could measure as part of your study?
Yeah, so in the land tenure security in developing countries literature, people look for a lot of things. There's pretty limited evidence for most of them, and it could be because of some of the measurement issues that I talked about. The reason that I've focused on tree planting is both because it's relatively easy to see, but also it's the one for which there's most evidence in previous studies. But things that other researchers think are likely to go on in Benin, one of them is really tricky, which is land fallowing. So it's where you take a field, you don't plant any crops on it for a year and basically let the soil recover. And to me, in the way I have this set up, that looks like a decrease in the dry season NDVI because there are no plants. And so I would be taking that currently as evidence of decreased investment, where really it would be evidence of increased investment. And the reason that you might not want to fallow if you don't have secure land tenure is somebody might say, well, you're not using your land, so I'm going to take it. So giving some people property rights is something that might influence them to fallow their land more. Another thing that I'm interested in measuring that I haven't been able to so far is land sparing. So if people are able to invest in their land in ways like using fertilizer or using irrigation, or sort of water efficiency practices, they should be able to grow more on the same land. And as a result, they should be less likely to, because they're using intensification, they should be less likely to cut down neighboring ecosystems. So we could look at how much natural forest there is near these areas. And this is something that maybe we could do at the village level instead of just at the plot level.
I noticed one of our attendees has hit the raise hand button, which we've actually never had happen before. I might be able to allow that person to talk, although I'm always a little nervous to do that because who knows what's going to happen. If you have a question, though, you can type a text question into the Q&A box and I'll read it. While waiting on that, I'll say one other thing. So I'm sure a lot of people tuning in, and including me, I may or may not have a particular interest in land security or property rights, but I am interested in new forms of data. And I'm wondering if you've thought of other potential applications for remote sensing that in the social sciences that haven't been developed, or that where there's data there and sort of for the processing, right, for the analysis.
Yeah. There's a group at Stanford that's doing really good work that's sort of in the more looking at humans in built-up areas. And so they use remote sensing imagery to try to measure poverty. And so their goal is basically to figure out which areas of a country are sort of hardest hit by economic downturns, or which areas have sort of more poor areas. And they can do a good job of this by looking at sort of what roof types people have, something that's pretty easy to see. And then I'll take this to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing in the US here, which is we're using the same sort of Landsat imagery to develop a model that learns based on census blocks, kind of what the population or the population density, and also what the average income is across the whole US. And so our goal is to create this data set and then use it to ask questions like, instead of just being able to measure every 10 years, kind of how people are moving on a large scale or how income is changing, we can look at that on a much shorter time frame and also at a high spatial resolution. So the application that I'm working on, particularly here, is fracking and looking at how fracking affects population and income dynamics really close to the well, and then as you get farther and farther away, and also how that affects the movement of people.
So a written question came in from Phil Schroet. On a purely practical level, are there resources you would recommend for people trying to get into this, and what level of computing resources does it require?
So I can answer both of those together. What most remote sensing people use right now is a platform called Google Earth Engine. It's an API that you can access either via JavaScript in your web browser or in Python. And the great thing about this API is most of the computation occurs remotely on Google servers. And so you can run very large computations without destroying your computer for large periods of time or without having access to computational resources. The downside is that you have to either speak Python or JavaScript to be able to access those. But there are some really good tutorials on the Google Earth Engine website, and that's here at UCSD. We have a couple of courses that are devoted to remote sensing, and that's how we teach those courses.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say that's the end of today's presentation. I'd like to thank Luke for being our presenter this week. I'd like to note that this presentation will be posted to our website just after the broadcast if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again later. I'd also like to invite everyone to join us next week. This would be March 6th, I think. I forgot to write down the date on my little script here. Next Friday, when we will host a talk by David Carlson from Koç University. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. It's the one in Turkey. The talk is entitled Estimating a Counterfactual with Uncertainty Through Gaussian Process Projection, which actually kind of sounds a little bit relevant to what you're doing, given the synthetic control. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Luke, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Justin.
And hope to see everyone next week.